All right, well, welcome to Module 7. We've reached the end here. And so in this last module, we want to consider government regulation and how that can impact businesses and market efficiency. And so overall in this course, we've kind of seen how markets allocate resources and how that's going to impact businesses as key players in markets. Now, one of the main questions, of course, for any business is how to maximize profits. If you want to understand how much to produce and what price to sell at, you have to understand the structure of markets. As we've seen, are the markets competitive? Is it more of a monopolistic competition or an oligopoly where a few firms are competing? Do we have product differentiation? There's all sorts of factors that impact the demand curve that is facing a particular firm, and then how a firm should respond. We also have seen, as we just studied production, exactly how you can think about using inputs in a way that's efficient to produce at a minimum cost and to figure out the profit maximizing quantity to produce. But here we want to consider how government regulation can impact this story. And so there's really a few things that we want to consider. First of all, we want to start with thinking about why markets tend to often be efficient. Then we want to consider what happens when markets are not perfectly efficient. So we could call this market failure or maybe market imperfections, where the costs and benefits to producers don't perfectly align with the costs and benefits overall for various reasons. And then we can consider the goal of trying to improve on market failures. And so if markets are not as efficient in a certain case, at least in theory, there's the potential for governments to intervene and make things more efficient, although the policy has to be designed in a way that kind of incorporates the right information to make things better. So just because there's market failure doesn't mean that governments can make things better off, but if the market imperfections are substantial enough and we can understand how to design a policy well, there's the potential for government regulation to make things better. All right, so the first thing we want to do is consider economic efficiency and why competitive markets often achieve it without government regulation. And in those cases, government regulation can actually make things worse. And so markets are often efficient because they tend to consider the benefits to consumers. Consumers only buy a good if what they're willing to pay is higher than what the price is, so they value it more than what it costs. And producers tend to only produce something if the price they receive is greater than the cost of producing it. And if you combine those two things, you're going to see that, generally speaking, a transaction only occurs if and only if it makes both sides better off and it's improving efficiency. But there are cases where we have market failure, and so we want to look at the causes and consequences, including market power. So we've sort of seen, first of all, that market power changes the story for a firm trying to maximize profits. If you're in a competitive market, you just have to set the price at the competitive market price. If you have some market power, you can set price above marginal cost and potentially extract higher profits. And so it impacts businesses' profits, but it also impacts market efficiency. And by trying to get a higher price, often firms are going to have to restrict quantities, which leads to an inefficiently low quantity and some degree of market failure. And so competition tends to be better for market efficiency. Then we can look at externalities, where someone besides the buyer or seller is impacted either positively or negatively by a transaction. So for example, pollution would be a negative externality, or maybe like education could be a positive externality, or maybe like R&D can have spillovers that make other firms and other consumers better off. We could look at like common property resources and public goods, which are two cases where these types of things are non-excludable, meaning that you can't keep someone from accessing it even if they're not willing to pay for it, which can lead to sort of a version of externalities where the costs and benefits aren't fully taken into account by the individual making the decision. And then we can also see how imperfect information, if the consumer doesn't know enough about the prices of different goods, or they don't know the quality of different goods, that can lead markets to be less efficient. Okay, and so if we have an idea of what could be causing market failure, we can then look at how government policies potentially can make things more efficient if designed correctly. Like for market power, we could look at antitrust measures that try to preserve competition. For externalities, say like a negative externality caused by pollution, we could look at regulations or like a tax or subsidy that tries to take into account those benefits and costs going to other people. Or we could look at, in the case of public goods, say there's a good that's provided that benefits everyone. In some cases, it's better for the government to provide those goods since everyone's going to benefit. Like, for example, in essentially every country, there's a military that's paid for by the government because the country being protected against invasion tends to benefit everyone, so maybe it makes sense for everyone to pay for it through the government. All right, and then lastly, we're going to apply this with our final projects. And so thinking about market failure and government policy, we're going to assess the impacts of a specific policy from the perspective of a business in that industry. And so this is kind of the goal. A lot of this module is kind of giving you time to work on these final projects. Step one is like this policy brief, just like 5 to 7 pages, counting sources, where you can look through the guidelines when you look at the final project assignment. But you'll incorporate some theory from the book, some empirical evidence from some peer-reviewed studies, and then think about the impacts on a business in an industry that would be affected, along with impacts on consumers and the economy more broadly. And then you'll kind of take a stance sort of for or against this specific type of government policy. And so I want you to be able to learn through this final project. Let me know if you have questions or anything that I can kind of give input on as we go. But also I want you to learn from seeing what other people do. And so we're going to present these in like a 5-minute presentation, just doing a kind of a brief overview of your policy brief when we have our Zoom session. So if you want to make a few slides, then you'll have like 5 minutes to present to the group on Zoom about your final project. All right, so for Thursday night, the first thing we have is our second of 2 tests. We'll give you 2 hours to do that, so hopefully that gives you some time to work through things. It's open book and open notes. We'll cover chapters 8 through 14 for this test. And so some of the questions are more conceptual. They won't take as long. Some of them will be kind of interpreting a graph, and then some of them might include a little bit more calculation. But that'll be kind of the first part of this week, and then after watching this video, you can answer your last quick question about the intro video. And then we'll have our final discussion here. This is a little bit of a longer podcast, but this is from the National Association of Business Economists session at the big economics annual meeting for the Allied Social Science Associations. And so this is kind of 2 prominent economists, Guido Imbens, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, and John List. And so these guys will be talking about how economic research can help with business decisions. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys think about that. Then we'll have our final homework looking at this chapter 16, which I've given you a little bit of an overview of, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you'll have time to work on your final project, and we'll meet at the end of the week, Monday night, to kind of wrap up the semester and then present these final projects. All right, so government regulation of business. The first thing we might want to look at is why markets tend to be efficient. So we've talked about like consumer surplus and producer surplus. We've talked about how markets work. So it's worth kind of considering why markets tend to be generally pretty efficient. And so first of all, the demand curve is going to show us the marginal benefit to consumers at a given quantity. This tells us what someone is willing to pay for that additional unit. In other words, their marginal benefit that they receive from that additional unit. And so there's going to be some people that they buy the good no matter what because they have a high willingness to pay. So they'll be the first people to buy a good even if the price is high. As the price gets lower, there'll be people that decide they're eventually willing to buy it, revealing that they weren't willing to pay a lot, but they are willing to pay this lower price. And that means that as this quantity increases, we're adding more and more people that have a lower and lower marginal benefit. from consuming this good. And then if we look at supply, the supply curve tells us the marginal cost of producing additional units, as we've kind of seen as we've looked at production over the last few modules. And so as a result, markets, when they're competitive and when we don't have externalities and other things going on, we'll look at kind of some reasons that markets might fail and this might not hold. But if we have markets working well, we tend to kind of have every win-win opportunity taken advantage of, because as long as the benefit to the consumer of an additional unit is greater than the cost of the producer, these transactions occur. Each transaction occurs if and only if it makes both sides better off. And so this price will be found here. We have this equilibrium quantity. And this equilibrium quantity is the efficient quantity because it's the quantity where marginal benefit to the consumer equals marginal cost to the producer. And so we get all of this surplus here. This is what the consumer is willing to pay for this unit. This is the marginal cost. And so the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost for all these units. That gives us our surplus. If we add it up for all of these, we get this kind of whole area of surplus. So this top area here would be our consumer surplus. This bottom area here was our producer surplus. And our total economic surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And one way of saying why markets are efficient is because markets maximize this surplus, because each transaction occurs if and only if the marginal benefit to the consumer is greater than the marginal cost to the producer. But in some cases, markets can fail, and so in some cases, consumers, their incentive to buy something might not always align with the true marginal benefit to everyone. And same would go for the producer. In some cases, the marginal cost to society of producing an additional unit might diverge from what the cost is for the producer. And so one reason for market failure would be market power. If we look at like a monopoly, we know from before that if this is our demand curve, which reflects the marginal benefit to the consumer for each unit, the marginal revenue curve, which is what matters to the producer, is going to slope downward faster, because when they sell an additional unit, they not only get their revenue from selling to an additional customer, but they lose revenue because they have to lower the price on people who would have been willing to pay more. So let's say this is their marginal cost of production. The efficient quantity would be here. That would be like a competitive outcome if we have price equals marginal cost. But what the producer wants to do is they want to restrict this quantity to get more profit so they can sell at a higher price. So they would want to pick this quantity here where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The efficient quantity is where the marginal benefit equals marginal cost. The marginal benefit to the consumer equals the marginal cost of the producer. But the monopolists, they might stop sooner because the marginal revenue is less than the marginal benefit to the consumer. The producer's incentive to sell is based on the marginal revenue, but the true benefit of selling additional units is based on this marginal benefit to the consumer. And so they're going to pick a lower quantity to sell at a higher price, and that helps them get more profits here. But the bad news is that we have this deadweight loss here. For these units here between the monopolist quantity and the efficient quantity, the benefit to the consumer, the marginal benefit, is greater than the cost of production, but these transactions don't occur because the marginal revenue for the firm is less than the marginal cost. And so this is what we call deadweight loss, or lost economic surplus, which means that our social efficiency is going down. We can also look at externalities. And so, for example, if we look at a negative externality, we could have a positive one as well. That means someone else besides the producer or consumer is negatively affected when this good is produced or consumed. So in this case, the social marginal cost, which is the cost to everyone in total when an additional unit is produced, is going to be the private marginal cost, that's the cost of production for the firm, plus this external marginal cost, which is this cost that's imposed on some third party, someone else, like a bystander. So pollution would be an example where there's the cost of producing the good, but there's also this cost that's imposed when the pollution occurs from producing some good. So our supply curve reflects, in this case, our private marginal cost. So we just have our demand curve, that'll be our marginal benefit curve. And then we're going to have some externality that's going to make the social marginal cost greater than the private marginal cost. And as a result, markets are going to pick this equilibrium quantity where supply and demand intersect. So markets, they keep producing as long as the benefit to the consumer is greater than the cost to the producer. But the problem in this case is that we're ignoring part of this cost that's imposed on other people. And so the efficient quantity would actually be back here. So the efficient quantity is going to be where social marginal benefit equals social marginal cost. In this case, where the demand curve intersects with the social marginal cost curve. But markets, they're going to pick the quantity where the private marginal benefit equals the private marginal cost. Now, if there's no externalities, then private marginal benefit and social marginal benefit are the same, and social marginal costs and private marginal costs are the same. But if there's an externality, in this case, with a negative externality, there's a difference between the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost. And so we'd want to pick this lower quantity. But the market, they're going to tend to produce too much. And as a result, the cost of these additional units to society is greater than the benefit to consumers. And we end up with this deadweight loss, or this reduction in economic surplus. So we produce too much of things with negative externalities because people don't consider the costs imposed on other people. Non-excludability creates a sort of externality. If we have like a common property resource, like say there's like a lake with fish that anyone has access to. It's non-excludable, so anyone can access it, even if they don't pay for access. And so in this case, what we're worried about is overuse of this commonly held resource. And the reason is that if you consume, the individual gets the benefit of consuming using this resource, say like catching fish from the lake. But the cost is shared by everyone. There's this collective cost of this resource being depleted. And if people aren't considering other people's welfare, maybe it's just out of sight, out of mind, they might be focused on the benefit they get from catching more fish, but they only bear some small fraction of the cost of the fish being depleted. Most of that cost is shared by everybody else. And that can lead to overuse because people are not paying enough attention to this cost that goes to everybody else. Another example would be like the split the check problem. If you agree with your friends to split the check at the restaurant, you might be tempted to buy more expensive things. Say if you get a fancy steak, you get all the benefit of getting the steak, and that cost of the steak is shared across everyone else. You only get a small fraction of that cost, which can lead to overuse. Another example of non-excludability would be a public good. And so it's non-excludable, but the key difference here as well is that it's also non-rival, or you could say it's non-depletable. With a common property resource like a lake with fish, one person catching a fish takes away from what other people are able to catch. With a public good, that's not true. So say like we have like a fireworks show. Once the fireworks are produced or purchased, everyone gets to enjoy it, and one person looking at the fireworks doesn't take away from someone else also watching the fireworks. And so in this case, we tend to have under provision public goods. This is like the free rider problem. And that's because if you pay for a public good, you take on the cost of paying for it, but everyone else is going to benefit from having access to this good. And so if you buy the fireworks, you have to pay for it, but everyone else is going to share the benefit of watching the fireworks. And as a result, we tend to have the free rider problem where people don't want to pay for public goods, they'd rather have other people pay for it. This is why, for example, teachers have to be kind of careful with group work, because if you have a group project, there's always this temptation that people are going to try to free ride and make other people do the work, since when you work on the group project, you have to take on the cost of effort and everyone else benefits from your work. Lastly, we could also look at information and market failure. And so if both sides are well informed about a transaction, markets tend to be pretty efficient. But if one side doesn't know as much, that can lead to some information problems. Say the consumers don't really know the prices of different goods, it's hard for them to make good decisions, and that changes how markets operate. Or if consumers don't know the quality of a good, that can lead to some problems as well. So that gives you kind of an overview. Let me know if you have questions as you're kind of looking at your projects and kind of wrapping up the semester here. But we'll see you at the end of the week.